The Biden administration has agreed to allow up to 250 asylum seekers into the U.S. per day. The agreement stems from an ACLU lawsuit to stop the expulsion of migrant families under a Trump-era policy that continues under the Biden administration. A new article from ProPublica tells the stories of people who have tried to cross the border and dives into the confusion that's driving more people to it. Lomi Kriel is with us now. She is a reporter with ProPublica-Texas, Tribune, Investigative initiative, and she wrote the piece. Thank you so much for joining us, Lomi. Let's just start with this new information that we're getting out of the Biden administration, that they are agreeing to allow people who have been forced to go back to Mexico to cross the border, 250 people, so they can continue their case, their asylum case, on American soil. Is that enough? It seems like a drop in the bucket, but is that enough to make a difference?
You're right. I mean, compared to the thousands of people that are waiting in Mexico, it is still a very small number, but it is quite significant in the sense that up until now, the Biden administration has continued the health order that the Trump administration instituted last March, citing the pandemic, and expelled most migrants who cross the border immediately in a process that lasts about 90 minutes without asylum interviews. So this is sort of a significant step in allowing some vulnerable asylum seekers into the U.S.
So can you help our audience understand what the actual immigration policies are right now and who is allowed in?
Yes, and it is very complicated, not only for the most importantly the migrants themselves, but for anyone following this issue, because there are so many varying directives in place. So as I just said, the Biden administration has continued this health order that the Trump administration instituted, expelling most migrants at the U.S. Mexico border. However, there are significant exceptions to that, including this new development overnight. But in addition to that, the administration has decided to not expel children who cross the border alone, changing Trump policy, and allow them in to continue their asylum cases in the U.S. They also are allowing in some families, in part because the Mexican government in the state of Tamaulipas, which is borders South Texas, is not accepting families with young children there. So the Biden administration, in many cases, is accepting those families when they cross in South Texas. But then they're still mostly expelling adults and some families, and then they are letting other migrants who have been waiting in Mexico under a different Trump policy and have pending immigration cases. They're allowing those in under a process coordinated by the United Nations. So there's so many different things going on that it is very confusing for migrants who often think, well, I hear some people are getting in, so I may as well try.
You spoke to a lot of people who have tried to cross the border for your article. Is there a particular story that stands out? I'm sure you heard a lot of heartbreaking stories. A particular story that stands out that captures the issue at the border?
Yeah, I mean, all of these stories are just always heartbreaking because, people for the most part are coming here, especially now. We're seeing after the pandemic, situations in their home countries have just really deteriorated, particularly in Central America. So people are coming here out of desperation. One of the people I spoke with, I met him outside of a migrant camp in Matamoros, across from South Texas. And he was just desperate. He had come here because gang members in Honduras had tried to force him to sell drugs. When he refused, they killed his brother. So he came here, tried to cross into the U.S. He was returned to Mexico under a Trump policy called the Migrant Protection Protocols. He waited in Mexico for 2 years trying to make his claim for asylum. That was denied in this process that lawyers have called flawed legal process. And he was trying to, wait for Biden to come in and hoping that he would get a second chance. But then the Mexican government deported him in March. So he's now back in Honduras and living in fear of the situation there. And he told me last week that he was going to come back and try again because he has no hope there. And I think his story just sort of shows the desperation that many people are in, and mostly the confusion that they feel, because this guy, Marvin, was telling me that a lot of other migrants he knew at the U.S. Mexico border had been allowed in. And so he was sort of confused why he wasn't getting that same treatment.
You wrote that some of the confusion is actually coming from smugglers giving people false information, which just adds an extra layer of sadness to the stories that you're telling. Explain how these smugglers cash in on folks trying to cross the border looking for a better life, what is common. It really is horrific, but we should also put in the context that the smugglers themselves are part of this system too, where they themselves are poor and have very limited. I'm sort of trying to be sympathetic to people who are at their wits' end, even though they're exploiting other people. It's not as if they are some kind of fat cats living high off the hog. These people are also struggling and suffering.
Yeah, I mean, the system, this has now been built up over many years where every part of the system somebody is benefiting, and smugglers benefit anytime that U.S. immigration policy is more confusing, because migrants seek them out and ask them for help. And especially now, given this new health order that automatically expels most migrants, as we talked about, it's increasingly difficult to be allowed into the U.S. unless you're one of these many exceptions that we talked about. So people are relying on smugglers, trying increasingly more dangerous ways to slip in undetected. And especially after the pandemic, people are just really in bad situations in their home countries, and smugglers are telling them that Biden is letting people in, the time to come is now, which is not unusual. Over many times under previous points of the Trump administration or prior, they've done similar things, but it's sort of aggravated now just because there's so many different competing messages, and so it is easier to kind of manipulate migrants at this point, especially.
So what is the Biden administration trying to do about this influx of people at the border and the immigration system in general? What did the experts you talked to say needs to be done?
The Biden administration has repeatedly said, don't come now, we're fixing an asylum system and an immigration system that has been broken under the Trump administration. That message, as we said, is not working particularly well. But in the meantime, they have done some things. They have, they're working in Central America. They've committed some more aid. They've allocated a small amount of temporary work visas for Central Americans. And then some of these other things are still in the works. What experts say should be done is the Biden administration should have asylum officers adjudicate some of these claims at the border directly, rather than have it be under the immigration court system, which is very backlogged. And once you're in that system, it can take more than 2 years to decide a case. So that just adds to sort of the delay and also the confusion. But I think also a key thing is sort of having a system where it's clearer for people when you will be allowed in and when you won't, but having some way, some avenues where you can make protection claims or you can provisionally work here is, what many of the experts said is key, because at the moment, especially for people from Central America, which make up the biggest drivers of migration to the U.S. Mexico border right now, there really isn't many ways to come here in any lawful avenue. So that's why we sort of see this buildup at the border, because asking for asylum there and crossing illegally is sort of the main way that they can come to the U.S.
some really fascinating and important reporting. Lomi Kriel, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.